Imagine dedicating 18 months to mastering the skill of becoming completely invisible. You train yourself to control every breath, so your chest never causes the grass around you to move. You learn to estimate distance by measuring the width of a man's shoulders from 400 meters away. You learn to wrap the barrel of your rifle in strips of burlap because even the slightest flash of exposed metal can reveal a position that took you hours to choose. And above all, you learn that the most dangerous moment in a sniper's life isn't the instant the trigger is pulled. It's the second that comes afterward. It is the summer of 1944 in Normandy. You are a German sniper, one of the finest in the field. You've carefully studied the 25-page manual issued by the Army High Command on May 15, 1943, simply titled Instructions for the Training and Employment of Snipers. You've spent hundreds of hours training. Your doctrine is straightforward. Wait for the officer. Wait for the radio operator. Wait for the target whose death will have the greatest impact. One shot, one kill. Then relocate. One morning, concealed in a sunken Norman lane behind a seemingly impenetrable hedgerow, you notice something. Exactly the kind of sign your training taught you to recognize. The rounded top of an American M1 helmet slowly rises above the hedge. Unsteady, careless, just like an exhausted infantryman, cautiously peeking over before pushing forward. You calm your breathing. Slowly, you squeeze the trigger. The sharp crack of your carabiner 98K rings out across the field. The helmet vanishes instantly. Then, nothing. No body falls. No cries for help. No soldiers rush to rescue a wounded comrade. The battlefield becomes eerily quiet. And then, you hear something you never expected. A heavy thud from somewhere behind the American lines. A plume of smoke. Then, another. And another. By now, you've already changed position. But it no longer matters. Mortar shells begin tearing apart the exact piece of ground where you had remained concealed for the past 6 hours. The figure in your scope wasn't a soldier at all. It was a helmet mounted on a stick, raised by a private from Iowa who never exposed his head above the trench. And during the brief moment you fired, 3 unseen Americans had already spotted your muzzle flash through a periscope. This is the story of one of the oldest tricks in military history. A trick that existed long before the modern rifle. The Americans didn't invent it. Yet when U.S. troops began using it against Germany's sniper network during the summer of 1944, something inside that system started to fail. German officers, even decades after the war, repeatedly described it with the same word. Unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. German snipers weren't defeated by better American marksmen. In fact, the U.S. Army openly admitted it never established a proper sniper school throughout the entire Second World War. What destroyed German snipers in Normandy was something far more unusual and much harder to overcome. It was an idea about forcing a man to fire when every instinct tells him not to. An idea that turned the very discipline making a sniper deadly against him. Using nothing more than a simple piece of pressed steel. To understand why that strategy worked, we first need to understand what made German snipers almost impossible to detect in the first place. Because before there was the helmet, there was the hedge. And before the hedge, there was the most patient killer the Wehrmacht had ever created. The Normandy bocage was the worst terrain imaginable for an attacking force. One American officer described it to an Associated Press reporter as a series of fortresses repeating every 100 yards. Every hedgerow was a massive wall of packed earth, topped with thick brambles and small trees, so dense you couldn't see through it and so solid that rifle bullets couldn't penetrate it. Between these barriers stretched narrow, sunken lanes, cool and shaded, offering the perfect route for advancing patrols, and the perfect killing ground for defenders who had spent weeks learning every inch of the landscape. It was into this unforgiving countryside, during June and July of 1944, that the Germans deployed the most patient killers the Wehrmacht had to offer. Consider the doctrine they were trained to follow. The leaflet issued in May 1943 captured everything the Wehrmacht had learned through brutal experience on the Eastern Front. A sniper wasn't simply a skilled marksman. He was a strategist carrying a scoped rifle. He was taught to study the terrain for hours before selecting a position, to measure every landmark within sight, and memorize the distance to that fence post, that broken tree, that shattered rooftop, so when a target appeared between them, he could fire without calculating the distance. He was instructed to dig below ground level, never shoot from a position he couldn't leave unseen, and value patience above everything else. The leaflet made one thing perfectly clear. A sniper who fired at every opportunity would likely be dead within a week. A sniper who waited, letting 4 or 5 lesser targets pass before taking the 6th, would survive, and prove far more valuable than a dozen impatient marksmen. From that doctrine emerged men like Matthias Hetzenauer, a 19-year-old Austrian from the Tyrolean village of Brixen im Thule. Drafted into the Wehrmacht's 3rd Gebirgsker Division, he fought on the Eastern Front for less than 2 years and ended the war with 345 confirmed kills. His longest confirmed shot was reported at 11,100 meters. To understand that distance, imagine a man appearing through a 4-power carabiner 98K scope as nothing more than a tiny vertical speck, no larger than a thumbnail held at arm's length. Hetzenauer struck targets like that again and again. He succeeded because he never fired until he was absolutely certain. Not in Nazi Germany, even certainty became a matter of paperwork. A confirmed kill required an officer or fellow soldier to witness the shot and verify in writing that the target had fallen. The sniper's badge, introduced on August 20, 1944, came in 3 classes. 20 confirmed kills earned 3rd class, 40 earned 2nd class, and 60 earned the coveted 1st class with its gold cord. Hetzenauer's real total was almost certainly far higher than the official figure, because, amid the chaos of battle, most kills went unwitnessed. By every standard that mattered to the military that trained him, he represented the perfect example of German sniper doctrine. The American GI fighting in Normandy wasn't facing Hetzenauer himself. He remained on the Eastern Front. But the countless German snipers in the West were shaped by the very same philosophy of patience, precision, and one carefully verified shot. So, what did that patience actually look like in combat? A captured German sniper from the Hitler Youth Division, questioned near Cayenne in late July 1944, explained his rules of engagement to American intelligence officers. He had been ordered to fire only when he clearly saw an officer's cap badge or the antenna wire of a radio operator. Any shot taken without certainty wasted both ammunition and precious time because every bullet exposed his position. He had also been instructed to ignore any movement lasting less than 3 seconds. Every lesson in his training emphasized restraint and careful risk management. On paper, it was a system that should have been nearly impossible to defeat, and against enemies using conventional tactics, it usually was. What a platoon leader's account, preserved in the U.S. Army's Wartime Combat Lessons series, shows exactly what happened when American troops advanced without an answer to this kind of opponent. The officer ordered one squad to move from one hedgerow to the next. During the advance, a single soldier was struck by one sniper round. The entire squad immediately dropped to the ground. Then, as the officer later described, they were picked off one by that same hidden sniper. One bullet, one position, multiple casualties. That was exactly what the German sniper system had been built to achieve. What did a clear target look like through a German sniper's scope in Normandy during July 1944? An American helmet slowly rising above a hedgerow, a shoulder appearing where it shouldn't, a soldier lighting a cigarette, its tiny glow visible from 600 meters away. German rules of engagement, deeply rooted in their training, were simple. Fire only at a visible target. Never waste a bullet on suspicion. Never shoot at what you cannot identify. A skilled sniper waited for certainty. And in the bocage of Normandy, that certainty was exactly what a simple piece of pressed manganese steel, stamped out in a factory in Detroit, was about to provide. To understand how that became possible, we need to go back about 30 years, to the trenches of an earlier war, and to a remarkably tall, remarkably unusual Englishman who first discovered that a piece of papier mick could make an enemy pull the trigger. Hesketh Pritchard was, by almost any standard, one of the most unconventional officers in the British Army during the First World War. He was an explorer who had traveled through Patagonia and the high Arctic. He was a big game hunter, an outstanding cricketer, a journalist, and the author of adventure novels. As his obituary later noted, he stood nearly 6 feet tall, making him almost impossible to miss in the narrow trenches of the Western Front. By 1915, Hesketh Pritchard had noticed something British generals were reluctant to admit publicly. German snipers were killing British infantrymen at a rate that was, in his own careful words, very bad for morale. The reason was straightforward. Germany entered the war with thousands of hunting rifles already fitted with telescopic sights. Built before 1914 for wealthy civilians and quickly adapted for military use. They also had an organized sniper training system that Britain had never bothered to create. Throughout late 1914 and early 1915, German snipers quietly inflicted a steady stream of casualties along the British front. Compared with the massive battles that followed, those losses seemed small on paper. But Hesketh Pritchard highlighted one number that mattered most. A single experienced German sniper, he wrote, could easily cause 30 or 40 casualties. Repeated across the front, that slow but relentless toll was hollowing out the British infantry from within. In 1916, he established the first Army School of Sniping, Observation, and Scouting. Among the many techniques developed there, one would survive for more than a century because of its remarkable simplicity. It was nothing more than a papier mick head, carefully painted to resemble a human face, mounted on a stick that a soldier could safely raise above the trench, while remaining completely hidden below. The method was brilliantly simple. Whenever a German sniper was believed to be watching a particular section of the line, the dummy head was slowly lifted above the parapet, imitating the cautious movement of a careless infantryman. If the sniper fired, the bullet passed through the fake head, leaving both an entry and exit hole. A British observer, watching through a periscope, could then trace a straight line through those holes back toward the bullet's origin. Wherever that line reached the German trench was, with surprising accuracy, the sniper's hiding place. What Hesketh Pritchard had created wasn't another weapon. It was a way of turning an enemy's greatest strength into his greatest weakness. The same precision that made the German sniper so deadly also meant his bullet traveled in an almost perfectly straight line. Once that line was traced backward from its impact point, it pointed directly to him. Britain's counter-sniper program, built around this method and similar techniques, transformed trench warfare. In his 1920 memoir, Sniping in France, Hesketh Pritchard wrote that by the end of the war, the school he founded was producing trained snipers at 3 times the rate of any comparable institution in the world. His Military Cross citation, issued in October 1916, stated plainly that his work had directly and indirectly caused enormous casualties among the enemy. That was the distant origin of the tactic the Americans would later use in Normandy. But there's an even closer connection, and to find it we have to travel east, to Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942. There, a quiet Soviet hunter from the Ural Mountains, the son of a bookkeeper named Vasily Zaitsev, described an incident in his memoir that Hollywood would later transform into a famous film. Strip away the drama, and the historical core remains. Zaitsev wrote that he had spent several days hunting a German sniper hidden among the ruins of Stalingrad. That sniper had already wounded 2 of his fellow Soviet marksmen, working with his spotter, a soldier named Kulikov. Zaitsev narrowed the Germans' location to a pile of shattered rubble after spotting a tiny flash of reflected light. Glass. A rifle scope. What Kulikov did next followed Hesketh Pritchard's method almost exactly. This time, among the ruins of a city the English officer had never seen, against an army familiar enough with his ideas to publish his book in German. Kulikov slowly lifted a helmet, mounted on a stick through a broken window. The German sniper fired immediately. Then, he made one fatal mistake. He leaned out from his hiding place to check whether his shot had found its target. In that single instant, Zaitsev fired and killed him with a shot to the head. The technique had crossed countries, languages, and generations, linking an English big game hunter writing in Edwardian prose to a Soviet peasant recording his memories in plain Russian. What never crossed over was German doctrine. Every German sniper manual examined by Allied intelligence during the war recognized the helmet trick as a known danger, but avoiding it was left entirely to the sniper's own judgment. On paper, the solution seemed straightforward. Never fire at uncertain targets. Confirm before engaging. Wait until the head and shoulders are clearly visible. Yet that answer was already part of the trap. The more disciplined a German sniper became at verifying his target, the more confidently he would fire at a target carefully designed to pass every one of his checks. In the bocage of Normandy, just 2 summers after Stalingrad, that weakness in German doctrine was about to be exploited on an industrial scale. Take a look at an American M1 helmet from above. Its shape is so distinctive that it became one of the defining military symbols of the 20th century. Rounded, deep, slightly flared over the ears and at the back, with a short brim above the forehead. Viewed through a 4-power scope from 200 or 300 meters away, it couldn't be confused with the German Stahlhelm, with its squared, coal scuttle profile. It couldn't be mistaken for the French Adrian helmet with its central crest, or the British Brodie helmet with its wide, shallow rim. It was unmistakably American. For a German sniper trained to identify targets before firing, the M1 helmet was both a blessing and a curse wrapped into the same piece of steel. The blessing was instant identification. The curse was that the Americans knew exactly what he was looking for. This is how a simple steel helmet, manufactured by McCord Radiator and Manufacturing in Detroit, began defeating some of the most disciplined snipers in Europe. Think about what a soldier actually sees when someone slowly rises behind a hedgerow. The helmet appears first. The face remains hidden below it. That helmet creates the unmistakable outline of a soldier. Every trained sniper scanning the hedgeline had been taught to recognize that exact silhouette. He centered his crosshairs on it. He waited the split second for the head and shoulders to follow. Then, he fired. The Americans understood this perfectly. Official U.S. Army manuals during the Second World War never formally described using helmets as decoys, largely because the Army still lacked an official sniper school. Instead, the technique spread the old-fashioned way, from experienced sergeants to new privates on the battlefield. By the autumn of 1944, nearly every frontline GI in Europe understood the basics. A helmet mounted on a stick. A helmet balanced on a rifle butt. A helmet raised slowly into view, paused for a moment, then lowered again, exactly the way a tired soldier might cautiously look over cover. The performance had to feel believable. A helmet jerked upward too quickly looked fake. A helmet lifted gradually, over 5 or 6 seconds, looked human. German sniper training worked against its own soldiers in 2 different ways. First came patience. They had been taught never to fire at uncertainty, only at confirmed targets. A helmet slowly rising above a hedge matched every requirement their training demanded. The right shape, the right color, the right movement. Their instinct to wait, verify, and become absolutely certain. The same instinct that made them deadly also convinced them to fire at nothing more than an empty steel helmet. Second came the doctrine of the single shot. German sniper schools emphasized firing one carefully aimed round before immediately relocating. The Americans weren't trying to make German snipers miss, they simply wanted them to shoot. Whether the bullet hit or missed, whether the target was real or fake, every shot produced the same unmistakable signs: a muzzle flash and a small cloud of disturbed dust around the rifle barrel. Once spotted, those clues became a death sentence. Technology made the tactic even more effective. By 1944, American infantry companies carried trench periscopes based on the same basic design British troops had used in 1916, improved through decades of military experience. A soldier hidden behind a hedgerow could observe the entire enemy line without exposing even an inch of himself, while one corporal slowly lifted a helmet on a stick. Another GI positioned 50 feet away watched the opposite tree line through a periscope. The moment the German sniper fired, three things revealed his location: a tiny puff of smoke, a slight movement among the leaves, and a brief orange flash. During the First World War, observers would trace the bullet's path through holes in the dummy head before sending out a counter-sniper patrol. In Normandy, the response became much faster and far more destructive. A radio message reached the company command post. A grid reference was reported. Within 2 minutes, often in less than 90 seconds, 60 mortar rounds crashed onto the sniper's position. The mortar crew had been waiting for exactly that call. This reveals the second great insight behind the helmet trick. It was never really a sniper duel. The Americans completely reversed the rules of sniper warfare. German snipers were trained to fight alone against another sniper or an exposed officer, believing victory depended on superior marksmanship. The Americans refused to fight that battle. Instead, they used a simple steel helmet to transform German sniper discipline into an artillery target. That was what German snipers struggled to understand. They hadn't been defeated by better marksmen. They hadn't been outshot by luck. They hadn't failed because their training was flawed. They had been defeated by an ordinary infantryman holding up an ordinary helmet while an entire mortar system destroyed the ground beneath them without ever needing to see them. That's why one word appears again and again in post-war German interrogations: not defeated, not surprised, but unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. The first widespread American use of helmet decoys actually appeared in Italy. The long, grinding campaign that began with the landings at Salerno in September 1943 then pushed north through Cassino, Anzio, and the Gothic Line, forced American troops to confront Germany's sniper system in unfamiliar terrain. Soldiers from the 36th Infantry Division and the 34th Infantry Division, fighting through mountains and villages long controlled by experienced German snipers, learned the technique through hard-earned experience. Veterans of the North African Campaign, where open ground made snipers less effective, suddenly found themselves entering stone villages where every window shutter might conceal a scoped Mauser rifle. Before crossing an unfamiliar street, raising a helmet on a rifle butt above a shattered window frame became a routine first move. It was in Normandy, however, that the technique reached its greatest effectiveness. The reason wasn't just the bocage. It was the sheer number of German snipers concentrated across that small stretch of countryside. The U.S. Army's Combat Lessons series, published throughout the war to pass battlefield experience back to training units in the United States, devoted several sections to dealing with German snipers in Normandy. Its advice was straightforward. Snipers were capable of stopping entire attacks. They were extremely effective. German soldiers were ordered to remain hidden even after American forces had advanced past them. Before any movement could continue, those snipers had to be located and identified. The helmet trick completely reversed that process. Instead of waiting for the German sniper to choose his target before trying to locate him, the Americans encouraged him to fire at something they didn't care about, while observers were already watching long before the trigger was pulled. One of the clearest first-hand accounts from a Western Allied soldier comes from Canadian veteran Mr. Parsons, whose oral history was recorded by Veterans Affairs Canada decades after the war. Parsons had landed in Normandy as a truck driver delivering ammunition to forward artillery positions. During his interview, he recalled being pinned down by a German sniper hidden in a tree. The response, carried out by a small group of soldiers, closely mirrored the method Hesketh Pritchard had described back in 1920. They tied a rope around a hat, climbed a nearby tree, and used the rope to slowly raise the hat along a branch. As Parsons explained in his own words, 10 chances to 1, the German sniper would be thinking somebody's crawling up that tree and fire some shots. The hat was only bait. The shots revealed the sniper's position. Parsons' story is especially valuable because it shows how the technique had spread beyond infantry units to truck drivers, cooks, artillery observers, and other support troops. By the end of the summer of 1944, the helmet decoy was no longer a specialized scouting trick. It had become ordinary battlefield knowledge, passed from soldier to soldier like sleeping with your boots on, or never lighting a third cigarette from the same match. The Wartime News Photo Archives preserve another clear example. A photograph in the Getty Images collection carries a simple caption: "An American soldier holds his helmet on his rifle to draw fire from enemy snipers in France." The image shows an M1 helmet balanced on the muzzle of an M1 Garand, lifted above a low wall. The soldier remains safely crouched below, glancing sideways at the camera, with the tired half-smile of someone who has repeated the routine countless times. The same tactic appeared during the assault on Brest, where the U.S. The 8th Corps spent 6 weeks reducing the heavily defended German garrison, commanded by Hermann Bernhard Romke. Fighting through shattered buildings at close range created countless hiding places for German snipers concealed in upper floors. Before entering a street, American squads often raised a helmet on the end of a bayonet through a broken window. If a sniper fired, the squad instantly knew which window to avoid and which one to attack. If no shot came after 30 seconds, they assumed the building was clear and moved inside. The helmet trick didn't save every life. Staff Sergeant Sherwood Hallman of the 175th Infantry Regiment fought through the defenses of Fort Carenru on September 13, 1944, only to be killed by a sniper the following day. He was 30 years old and left behind a 2-year-old son. But throughout the streets of Brest, where Hallman lost his life, the same simple trick saved many more soldiers than it failed to protect. War is rarely measured by perfection. It's measured by whether one method saves more lives than the alternative. The Battle of the Hartgen Forest, fought through the autumn and winter of 1944, made the helmet trick more difficult, but not useless. Thick woodland shortened visibility, meaning helmets could only be seen at close range. Yet those same short sight lines also limited German snipers. Units such as the 4th Infantry Division, the 28th Infantry Division, and the 8th Infantry Division, all of which suffered some of the campaign's highest casualties, continued using variations of the decoy throughout the forest. Sometimes soldiers simply raised a piece of equipment above a foxhole. Other times they built full-sized dummy figures from discarded uniforms stuffed with leaves and leaned them against trees. What the Americans understood, and what German training never fully accounted for, was one simple operational reality. A sniper who fires once must relocate. A sniper who stays put and fires again from the same position is unlikely to survive. The helmet trick existed for one purpose: force that first shot. Once the shot had been fired, the rest of the engagement shifted overwhelmingly in the Americans' favor. By the autumn of 1944, captured German snipers questioned by U.S. Army intelligence officers were regularly asked what they thought of the American technique. Their answers, preserved in wartime interrogation reports, weren't philosophical. They focused on small technical details. One Wehrmacht sniper observed that American helmets were usually raised more slowly than a real soldier would naturally move. Yet from the distances at which he was firing, the difference was almost impossible to recognize. Another admitted he had been trained to ignore movements lasting only a brief instant. But a helmet remaining visible for several seconds seemed to demand a shot together. Those observations pointed toward the same conclusion. The German sniper, trained to be patient, disciplined, and precise, became vulnerable to a trick built around those very strengths. He fired because the helmet appeared genuine. He fired because the target behaved exactly as his training said a real soldier would. He fired because his doctrine instructed him to engage what he could clearly identify. And in the half-second it took his bullet to travel from the barrel of his Mauser to an empty steel helmet, he had already revealed his own position to the Americans. If you had asked an American infantry sergeant in the autumn of 1944 why the helmet trick worked, you probably wouldn't have heard a lecture about psychology or military doctrine. You would have heard something much simpler. The Germans shoot at what they see. We give them something to see. Hidden inside that plain answer was a much deeper truth. German snipers weren't defeated by better American snipers. By its own admission, the U.S. Army's sniper program during the Second World War was still in its infancy. The Army never established a true sniper school. The Marine Corps produced excellent scout snipers in the Pacific, but their numbers remained limited. The Springfield M1903A4, the closest thing the Army had to a purpose-built sniper rifle, was reliable, but hardly exceptional. Germany, meanwhile, fielded rifles like the Karabiner 98K and the Gewehr 43, weapons capable of remarkable accuracy in skilled hands. The German sniper wasn't outshot. He was outthought. That is the real reason German post-war interrogations kept returning to the word unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. To call something incomprehensible is to admit it doesn't fit within the framework you were trained to understand. A German sniper in 1944 knew how to explain losing to a better sniper. He understood being pinned down by artillery. He understood being overwhelmed by advancing infantry. What he couldn't explain was being made irrelevant by nothing more than a steel helmet. Think about what that says about the wider war. We often explain the Allied victory through industrial production, overwhelming air power, the Manhattan Project, armored divisions, massive naval fleets, and strategic bombing campaigns. Those forces undoubtedly ended the war. But beneath those grand strategies, across thousands of small fields and hedgerows, victory was often decided by ordinary soldiers using practical, straightforward ideas. Sometimes a highly trained German specialist was defeated simply because an American GI thought of something any farm boy could have understood. On paper, Germany's sniper system was unquestionably more sophisticated. Its doctrine was stronger. Its confirmation procedures were stricter. It awarded prestigious sniper badges with gold cords. It produced men like Mathis Hetzenauer and Josef Allerberger, who accumulated hundreds of confirmed kills. By almost every traditional measure of military excellence, the German sniper received better training. But that training existed inside a closed system. It taught him to fire at what he could clearly identify, and so he fired at what he believed he saw. The institution that trained him offered no way to recognize, in the critical moment, that what appeared to be a perfect target had actually been designed to deceive him. The American infantryman operated very differently. He learned the fundamentals, then adapted to whatever the battlefield demanded. When soldiers in Italy or Normandy discovered that a helmet mounted on a stick reliably exposed hidden snipers, they didn't wait for a manual or official approval. One soldier showed the next man in the foxhole. That man taught the replacement who arrived 3 weeks later. The idea spread naturally from sergeant to private, without formal instruction, written doctrine, or specialized schools. By the time the U.S. Army officially documented counter-sniper tactics after the war, the helmet trick had already become second nature to countless infantrymen. That answers the question at the heart of this story. German soldiers weren't baffled because the helmet itself was an ingenious invention. Hesketh Pritchard had already used essentially the same method against them during the First World War. German officers had read his work. Their training manuals even included ways to recognize and avoid such decoys. The captured Wehrmacht sniper questioned near Cayenne could probably have recited those countermeasures from memory. What truly puzzled the Germans was something else entirely. The tactic defeating them was so simple that the American soldiers using it didn't even think of it as a special tactic. The papier-mâché head, built by British engineers in 1916, was carefully designed by specialists. It was a purpose-built military tool. The American helmet balanced on a rifle barrel in 1944 wasn't. It was simply a piece of everyday equipment lifted by an exhausted private who hadn't slept in 2 days. It didn't feel like doctrine. It felt like the kind of trick someone might use while hunting in the woods, rustling leaves, to lure a turkey closer. And that, ultimately, was the real power behind it. The Germans weren't confused by a more advanced idea. They were confused by a simpler tool used with greater flexibility. They had prepared for a battlefield where doctrine decided outcomes. Instead, they found themselves fighting soldiers willing to ignore doctrine whenever a simpler solution proved more effective. There is one final irony. After the war ended, and Germany's sniper schools disappeared, men like Matthias Hetzenauer returned to quiet lives in the Tyrol. But the lessons of the helmet decoy survived. They became part of the training manuals of armies that adopted American counter-sniper methods. U.S. Army field manuals from the 1950s and 1960s describe the helmet decoy as a standard battlefield technique. Even today, soldiers around the world continue using the same simple trick. Photographs from Mosul in 2017 show Iraqi federal police raising helmets on sticks to attract Islamic State sniper fire. Images from the trenches outside Bakhmut in 2023 show Ukrainian soldiers doing exactly the same thing, while another soldier watches through a periscope. The method has remained virtually unchanged for more than a century because it doesn't need to change. It works for the same reason it always has. Technology evolves. But the human mind does not. The system that produced Matthias Hetzenauer wasn't defeated by another system. It was undone by a method that existed outside any formal system at all. The German sniper's defeat wasn't simply a tactical loss. It marked the failure of an entire way of thinking about warfare. The conclusion is simple. The Germans possessed the stronger doctrine. The Americans found the stronger response. And that response was so ordinary, so unmilitary in appearance, so much like something a child might invent in a backyard, that the architects of Germany's sniper program never fully discovered how to defend against it. Turning a papier-mâché head into official equipment, or assigning a stock number to a helmet balanced on a rifle barrel, would have required a military system capable of recognizing the value of ideas that didn't fit inside doctrine. The Wehrmacht never developed that kind of flexibility. The U.S. Army did. The soldiers who raised those helmets above Normandy's hedgerows are almost all gone today. When people later asked them about the war, many simply shrugged and said it wasn't anything extraordinary. They probably wouldn't have described what they did as a tactic. They would have called it common sense or simply being careful. And inside that gap, between what they believed they were doing and what they actually achieved, lies one of the clearest lessons of the Second World War. The German sniper fired at the helmet, expecting a body to collapse behind it. It never happened. What truly collapsed instead was an entire theory of how disciplined armies were supposed to defeat their enemies. In its place came something older, quieter, and far more practical, the kind of battlefield wisdom a soldier learns after only a few weeks at the front. The understanding that you don't always have to be the better marksman. You only have to find a way to make the better marksman waste his shot. A simple piece of pressed steel made in Detroit, lifted by an exhausted soldier in France during the summer of 1944, that was one small way the war was won. One foxhole at a time. Not through brilliance alone, but through the willingness to ignore brilliance when a simpler solution worked better.